Amir sat on the cracked stone steps of his small home, his eyes fixed on the horizon. The sun was setting, casting an orange glow over the turquoise waters of the Indian Ocean. The gentle waves lapped against the shore, but there was a strange stillness in the air. The wind had quieted, and the usually bustling village of Hamjago felt unusually empty. "Have you heard the news?" his neighbor Fatima asked as she walked past. She was a short woman with tired eyes, always carrying a bundle of firewood on her back. Amir nodded. "The storm, Cyclone Chido, they say it's coming." Fatima stopped, her face clouded with worry. "It's no ordinary storm. The winds could destroy everything, and we have nothing to protect ourselves." Amir looked up at the darkening sky where the clouds were beginning to gather. The island of Mayotte, a small French territory off the coast of Madagascar, had seen its share of storms, but this one felt different. The air was thick with a sense of foreboding, like the island itself was holding its breath. Cyclones were not new to the people of Mayotte. Every year the winds would blow, the rain would fall, and people would huddle in their homes hoping for the best. But this storm was different. The news had spread quickly in the village that Cyclone Chido was stronger than any storm in nearly a century. It was already tearing through Madagascar, and soon it would reach Mayotte. Amir's heart tightened. He had heard the stories of how powerful cyclones could be, how they could tear apart houses, flood villages, and take lives. And with the authorities already cracking down on undocumented migrants like him, he couldn't help but wonder, would anyone come to help when the storm hit? Would they even care? His family had lived in Mayotte for years, but they were not citizens of France. They were part of the hundreds of thousands of migrants who had come from nearby Comoros and Madagascar, seeking a better life. They had no rights, no papers, and most of the time, they lived in fear of being caught and sent back. If the storm came, and if they were forced to leave their homes, where would they go? "Amir!" his mother's voice called out from inside the small tin-roofed house. "Help me with the boards. We need to secure the windows." Amir stood up and walked inside. His mother was busy tying ropes around wooden planks, preparing to board up the windows. The house was small, with a dirt floor and a few pieces of furniture. It was all they had, and they had to protect it from the storm. "Do you think it will be as bad as they say?" Amir asked, his voice low. His mother looked up, her face lined with worry. "We don't know, but we need to be ready just in case." She handed him a piece of rope. "Tie this around the door. We don't want it blowing open." Amir nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. Outside, the village was quiet. There was an uneasy energy in the air, and the usual sounds of laughter and chatter had faded. People were preparing, yes, but there was no real sense of calm. The fear was palpable. Rumors swirled. Some said the cyclone would destroy everything. Others claimed that the French government wouldn't send help to the migrant communities. Amir knew that most of the people in their village, like his family, had nowhere to go when things went wrong. The homes in their part of the island were made of scrap metal and wooden planks, hastily put together in places where the government had long abandoned. These were the poorest parts of Mayotte, home to families just like his, migrants without documents, struggling to survive. As night fell, the village seemed to shrink into itself. The few streetlights that still worked flickered as the first gusts of wind began to pick up. Amir's father returned from the market, carrying a small bag of rice and beans, supplies for the coming days. His face was drawn, and his eyes, usually full of warmth, now seemed clouded with worry. "We've done all we can," his father said. "Now we wait." But Amir couldn't help but feel a growing sense of dread. The calm before the storm was deceptive. He knew that when Chido arrived, it would not be just the wind that would threaten their lives. It was everything that came with it. The fear of being caught without papers, the fear of losing everything in a place that had never truly felt like home. As the wind howled outside, Amir lay awake in his small bed, listening to the distant sound of the ocean. He thought of his sister, Amina, who had gone to visit relatives in the southern part of the island. Would she be safe? Would they all survive the storm? Tomorrow, the cyclone would arrive. But tonight, the island held its breath. waiting for what was to come, and Amir, like everyone else, could only wait and hope. The winds came first. They howled through the trees, bending them like fragile twigs. The air turned cold, and the sky darkened, thick with swirling clouds. Amir's family huddled together in their small home, which creaked and groaned with every gust of wind. The storm had arrived. Cyclone Chido was no longer a distant threat. It was here, crashing down on their island with the fury of a beast unleashed. Amir's mother, Noura, hurriedly checked the ropes they had tied around the doors and windows. "Make sure everything is secure," she shouted over the growing noise of the wind. Amir nodded, but his heart raced with fear. The walls of their house were shaking, and the roof sounded like it might tear off at any moment. He glanced at his father, Yasir, who was staring at the door with wide eyes. His father was usually calm in a crisis, but tonight even he seemed nervous. The wind picked up speed, whistling through every crack and crevice. The rain began to fall in sheets, pounding against the tin roof with the force of stones. The noise was deafening, and Amir could barely hear his own thoughts above the storm's roar. "Stay close!" Yasser shouted, pulling Amir and his younger brother Sami to the center of the room. They sat on the floor, the flickering light of a single candle casting long shadows on the walls. The storm outside seemed to be getting stronger by the minute. Amir's mind raced. They had prepared as best as they could, but what good were ropes and boards against a storm like this? He thought of his friends in the village, the other migrants who lived in similar shacks made of wood and metal. Would they survive? Would anyone come to help them? Suddenly, a loud bang echoed from outside. Amir's heart leaped in his chest. It sounded like something had hit their roof. He looked at his father, but Yasser only nodded grimly, as if to say they couldn't do anything about it now. The wind howled again, and the walls of the house seemed to tremble. Then, with a sound like thunder, part of the roof ripped free, sending pieces of metal flying into the night. Rain poured in, drenching everything in sight. Noura screamed as she tried to hold onto the edges of the broken roof, but it was no use. The storm had taken control. "Get to the back," Yasser shouted, pulling his family toward the small storage room at the back of the house. It was the only part of the building that seemed to be holding up against the storm. But even as they moved, the wind seemed to push harder, driving them back. Amir stumbled, his heart pounding in his chest. The room was dark and small, and there was no room to breathe. The sound of the storm outside was almost unbearable, like 100 roaring lions. Amir could feel the fear growing inside him. They were trapped. The walls around them shook with every gust of wind, and it felt like the earth itself was being torn apart. "Papa, we can't stay here," Amir said, his voice trembling. Yasser looked at him, his face pale but determined. "We have to wait. It's too dangerous to go outside." Outside, the island seemed to be collapsing under the weight of Chido's rage. The rain fell in torrents, flooding the streets and turning the earth to mud. The wind screamed through the village, ripping apart trees and tearing the roofs from homes. It was like the storm was not just a force of nature, but a living thing, angry and unstoppable. Amir clung to his family, his thoughts racing. They were migrants, living in a place that had never fully accepted them. Even now, as the storm raged outside, he couldn't help but worry. What if no one came to help them? What if the authorities decided they weren't worth saving? What if they were left to face the storm alone? The storm raged on for hours, but it felt like days. The wind never stopped, and the rain didn't let up. At times, Amir thought he might drown in the noise. The roaring wind, the pounding rain, and the constant creaking of their house. His hands were numb from gripping his little brother's shoulder, and his heart felt heavy with fear and exhaustion. Finally, as dawn began to break, the storm began to ease. The wind, while still strong, had slowed, and the rain had turned into a light drizzle. The noise outside was less deafening, and Amir could finally hear his own breath. He stood up slowly, his legs shaking from the hours of fear and tension. "We have to check the damage," Yasser said quietly, his voice rough from the night's ordeal. He stepped toward the door, hesitating for a moment before opening it. Amir followed him outside, and what they saw made his breath catch in his throat. The village was unrecognizable. The streets were flooded with water, and debris from the storm was scattered everywhere. Houses were destroyed, some completely flattened, others with walls torn away. Trees had been uprooted, their branches twisted and broken. The air was thick with the smell of wet wood and the sharp sting of salt water. Amir's heart sank. His home, the small place they had fought so hard to build, was barely standing. The roof had been torn off, and the walls were buckling under the pressure of the wind. He could see his neighbors' homes, too. Most of them were gone, reduced to piles of rubble. Amir, his father's voice was low, filled with sadness. We have to find shelter. The storm is over, but there's no telling when help will come. But Amir knew deep down that the storm wasn't the only thing they had to fear. In the days to come, they would have to survive not only the wreckage of their homes, but also the knowledge that they had nowhere to go, no one to turn to. They were the forgotten ones, the ones who didn't belong. And as the wind continued to blow, Amir couldn't shake the feeling that they were truly alone in the world. The morning after the storm, the sky was a strange shade of gray, as though the clouds themselves were too tired to move. The winds had died down, but the damage Cyclone Chido had caused was unimaginable. Amir stood at the edge of his family's home, staring at the ruins of their village. The streets were unrecognizable. Piles of debris and broken trees littered the area, while the air smelled thick with the scent of wet earth and salt water. Amir, his father said softly, placing a hand on his shoulder, we need to find your sister. Amir's heart sank at the mention of Amina, his younger sister. She had gone to visit relatives in the southern part of Mayotte before the cyclone hit. She had promised to return before the storm, but the winds and rain had come so quickly, he hadn't been able to contact her. He hadn't heard from her since the night before. I have to find her, Amir said, his voice low but determined. He wiped the sweat from his brow, trying to shake the fear that gripped him. She could be in danger. His father nodded, his face grim. Be careful. The island is dangerous now. There are roads flooded, and many areas are still unreachable. But Amir wasn't listening. He turned and began walking toward the heart of the village, where the southern road led to Amina's relatives. He had to find her, no matter the cost. As he walked, he noticed the sheer scale of the devastation. Entire homes had been swept away by the storm, leaving only piles of rubble and broken wood. The few buildings that remained standing were damaged beyond recognition. People moved slowly through the wreckage, their faces blank with shock, searching through the ruins for signs of life. The streets were eerily silent, the usual sounds of daily life, children playing, neighbors talking, replaced by the distant hum of emergency vehicles. Amir's stomach churned with a mix of fear and sadness. This wasn't just a storm, it was a disaster, a tragedy that had affected everyone on the island. Whole neighborhoods were gone, leaving behind nothing but debris and memories. And with no electricity and communication cut off, the island felt as if it had been completely cut off from the rest of the world. He walked through the village, stepping carefully over fallen trees and broken glass. There were no clear paths anymore. Everything had been swallowed by the storm's fury. As he passed a collapsed house, he noticed a woman digging through the rubble. She looked up as he approached, her face streaked with dirt and tears. "Have you seen my son?" she asked in a trembling voice. "He was here when the storm hit. Please, have you seen him?" Amir shook his head, feeling the weight of the question in his chest. "I haven't." "I'm sorry," he said quietly, before continuing on his way. The sight of the woman's desperate eyes stayed with him. It was a feeling he knew all too well. The uncertainty of not knowing where your loved ones were, or if they were even alive, was like a constant ache in his heart. As he moved further into the village, Amir began to see more people, families and neighbors, all looking for their missing loved ones. Some had gathered in small groups, talking quietly as they exchanged news, while others wandered through the wreckage searching alone. The whole island seemed to be in a state of stunned disbelief. By the time Amir reached the road that led south, his legs were aching and his throat was dry. The road was flooded in some places, with water rising halfway up to his knees, making it nearly impossible to walk. He hesitated, looking at the murky water that stretched out in front of him. Maybe it's not safe, he thought to himself, but he couldn't turn back. His sister was out there somewhere, and he had to find her. With a deep breath, Amir pushed forward, wading through the water as it splashed around his legs. The path was uneven, and the water made every step harder, but he kept going. The storm had washed away the normal landmarks he knew, and he had to rely on memory to guide him. It wasn't long before he came across a familiar sight, a small wooden shack near the side of the road. It was Amina's aunt's house. Amir's heart leaped. He knocked on the door, but there was no answer. He tried again, this time calling her name. "Amina, Amina!" His voice cracked with desperation, but still there was no response. His stomach twisted with fear. The house had been damaged, but it still stood. Amina had been here, surely. But where was she now? As he turned away from the shack, his eyes caught sight of something in the distance, a small group of people standing near a pile of debris. Amir's heart skipped a beat. Could it be? He hurried toward them, pushing through the mud and debris, his feet slipping with each step. When he reached the group, he recognized a familiar face. It was Amina's aunt, her eyes swollen from crying, her hands shaking. "Amina," Amir asked breathlessly. His voice sounded strange in the heavy silence. She looked up, her expression a mix of relief and sorrow. "She was here," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "She was here, but when the storm came, we couldn't find her." The roof collapsed. Everything fell apart. Amir felt his world crumble. He had feared this. He had feared that his sister, the one person he loved most in the world, had been lost to the storm. But before he could say anything, Amina's aunt continued. "We think she might have gone toward the hospital. Some of the others said they saw her running in that direction." Amir's heart surged with new hope. The hospital was a few miles away, and if Amina had gone there for safety, there was still a chance. He turned to go, but his aunt grabbed his arm. "Be careful," she warned. "The roads are blocked, and the search teams haven't reached this part of the island yet." Amir nodded, but there was no stopping him now. He would find his sister, even if it meant searching through every wrecked building on the island. The devastation around him was overwhelming, but there was still hope. There had to be. As Amir walked toward the hospital, the weight of the disaster settled heavily on him. The island was torn apart, and many lives had been lost. But for the first time, he understood the true scope of the destruction. This wasn't just a storm. It was a catastrophe, and Mayotte would never be the same again. But Amir still had hope. He would find Amina. He had to. The sun was high in the sky now, but the heat seemed to press down on Amir like a heavy weight. His feet were sore from hours of walking, and his stomach growled with hunger. He hadn't eaten since the night before the storm, and the small bag of rice his father had saved was long gone. The island, once full of life and color, now felt like a different world, one of devastation, where survival was the only thing that mattered. Amir had left the hospital without finding Amina. The search teams hadn't reached the area yet, and there was no sign of her in the wreckage. His hope had begun to fade, but he couldn't stop searching. He had to keep moving, for his family's sake, and for his sister's. As he walked through the broken streets, Amir passed by groups of survivors who were huddled together, trying to make sense of the destruction. Most of them were from the informal settlements, shanty towns on the outskirts of the village where people lived in houses made from scraps of metal and wood. These neighborhoods, which had always been vulnerable to storms, were now reduced to piles of rubble. He saw a woman sitting on the ground, her face blank with exhaustion, cradling a small child in her arms. The child looked sick, pale and feverish, and Amir could hear her quiet whimpers above the noise of the wreckage. Nearby, a man was trying to gather pieces of wood to build a shelter, but his hands were shaking too much to make any progress. "Are you okay?" Amir asked, kneeling beside the woman. She didn't answer at first. Instead, she looked at him with tired, hollow eyes. Then she spoke in a soft, broken voice. We have nothing." The storm took everything. Amir glanced around. It was true. The homes in the settlement had been flattened, and the people who lived there had no resources to rebuild. There were no emergency shelters, no food, no water. The government's aid had been slow to arrive, and many of the survivors, especially the undocumented migrants, had nowhere to turn for help. "How long has it been since you last ate?" Amir asked, his voice gentle. The woman wiped her eyes, trying to compose herself. 2 days, she said. "We only have a little water left, but it's not enough." Amir's heart clenched. He had been focused on finding his sister, but the needs of these people were just as urgent. They were hungry. They were thirsty. And with no one around to help them, they were struggling to survive. "Where is your family?" Amir asked, looking around for anyone who might be able to help. The woman shook her head. "I don't know. I'm alone now. My husband didn't make it." Amir felt a pang of sorrow for her. This wasn't just a storm. It was a tragedy that had torn apart families, leaving so many people with nothing. And in the midst of the destruction, it was clear that the most vulnerable, those without resources, without papers, without a place to turn, were the ones suffering the most. "I'll try to find help," Amir said, standing up. "I'll bring you some food and water." The woman didn't respond, but her eyes followed him as he walked away. Amir knew it would be hard to find any supplies. The stores had been looted, and the roads were blocked with debris. But he couldn't just leave her and her child behind. They needed help, and he would do whatever it took to get it. He walked further into the settlement, his mind racing with thoughts of how to get food and water. He passed by more survivors. Some were digging through piles of rubble. Others were sitting in the shade of broken trees, waiting for something to change. But there was no sign of help, no sign of rescue teams. The island was in chaos, and no one seemed to know how to fix it. As Amir turned a corner, he found a small group of people gathered in front of a broken-down house. They looked like they were discussing something, their voices low and urgent. Amir approached them, hoping to find someone who might have an idea of where to find supplies. "Excuse me," Amir called. "Do you know where I can find food and water?" The group turned to look at him. There were 5 people, 3 men and 2 women. They looked worn out, their faces dirty and tired from the days of surviving on their own. One of the men, a tall man with a scar on his cheek, stepped forward. "There's a place a few miles from here," he said, his voice gravelly. "A storage facility. It's supposed to have food and water, but it's dangerous. The roads are blocked, and there are other groups trying to get there too. If you're going, you'd better be ready to fight for it." Amir's heart pounded in his chest. He hadn't expected this. He thought he might be able to find food without having to fight for it. But now, it seemed like survival itself had become a battle. "I'll go," Amir said, his voice firm. "I have to. My family is waiting." The man nodded. "Then you'd better be careful. You won't be the only one looking for food." Amir looked at the others in the group. They were all nodding in agreement, their eyes filled with the same fear and desperation that he felt. They were all in this together, but in a world like this, that didn't necessarily mean they were safe. As Amir left the group behind, he realized how far they had fallen. It wasn't just the storm that had destroyed their lives. It was the struggle for survival that followed. People who had once lived in peace were now fighting for the basics: food, water, shelter. The sense of community that had once been so strong had been replaced with a new kind of reality, one where every decision, every action, could mean the difference between life and death. Amir's thoughts turned to his family as he moved through the wreckage. His mother, his father, and his little brother were waiting for him. But with each step, the uncertainty grew. Would he be able to find the food and water they so desperately needed? Would he be able to bring it back without running into trouble? The island had become a place where survival was no longer about weathering a storm. It was about weathering the chaos that followed. Amir pushed forward, his determination growing stronger. He would find the supplies. He would protect his family. But he knew that in the world he now lived in, every choice he made would be a fight for survival. And the hardest part was yet to come. The days after the storm were long and uncertain. The wind had stopped howling, but the island of Mayotte still felt like a place trapped in chaos. Streets were filled with debris, homes were reduced to rubble, and the people who remained were tired, hungry, and scared. Amir had done everything he could to help his family survive, scouring the wreckage for food, helping his neighbors where he could, and holding on to the hope that Amina might still be alive. But as the days passed, his hope was beginning to fade. Then, one morning, everything changed. It started with a sound, distant, at first, like the hum of an engine. At first, Amir thought it was just another truck passing by, but then it grew louder. His heart raced as he stepped outside and looked toward the sky. He saw it. A helicopter, its blades spinning furiously as it flew low over the village. Amir's breath caught in his chest. It wasn't just one helicopter. There were several coming from the direction of the airport. Behind them, trucks filled with supplies and rescue teams followed. It was the first real sign of help in days, and it filled Amir with a sense of hope he hadn't felt since the storm hit. "Amir, look!" his father called from inside their shelter. Amir ran back to his family, excitement rushing through his veins. His mother, sitting with his little brother, looked just as shocked. They had heard the noise too. "They're here," Amir said, his voice almost a whisper. "The rescuers. They're here." His father stepped outside, his eyes squinting against the bright sun. He looked up at the helicopters, his face softening with relief. Maybe now things will get better," he said. The helicopters landed near the village center, and soon a small army of soldiers, doctors, and volunteers began unloading food, water, and medical supplies. Amir could hardly believe his eyes. There were boxes of rice, bottles of clean water, and bags of medicine, all the things they had desperately needed for days. For the first time since Cyclone Chido had struck, it felt like the island might finally begin to heal. Amir watched as people rushed toward the trucks, their faces filled with hope. The once empty streets were now alive with people coming together to receive the aid. Despite the destruction around them, there was a sense of unity, of shared survival. The island's residents, who had been scattered and isolated, were now all part of something bigger, a community that had endured and was still standing strong. As Amir and his family joined the others to collect food and water, Amir couldn't help but think about what he had witnessed over the past few days. He had seen families torn apart, homes destroyed, and people pushed to their limits. Yet, despite it all, the resilience of the people here had been unwavering. There was no giving up. No matter how hard things got, they found a way to survive, to keep moving forward. Amir thought about his sister Amina. He hadn't found her yet, but with the arrival of the rescue teams, he felt a renewed sense of hope. The search would continue. Perhaps, just maybe, he would find her among the survivors. He looked around at the people around him, neighbors, strangers, all working together to rebuild what had been lost. There was a glimmer of hope in the air, something stronger than just the supplies they had received. It was the feeling of coming together, of supporting one another through the darkest of times. As Amir helped his mother carry water back to their shelter, a man walked toward him. He was holding something small and wrapped in cloth. Amir's heart skipped a beat as the man came closer. "It's Amina," the man said, his voice shaky. "I found her. She's alive." Amir's chest tightened with disbelief, and for a moment, he couldn't find the words. He felt like the weight of the world had just been lifted from his shoulders. Amina, his sister, was alive. She had made it through the storm, and she was here. "Where is she?" Amir asked, his voice filled with emotion. The man nodded toward a group of people standing near the makeshift shelter. Amir ran toward them, his legs carrying him faster than he thought possible. And then he saw her. Amina was sitting on a blanket, surrounded by a few other survivors. Her face was tired, her clothes torn, but she was alive. And when she saw him, a small smile spread across her face. "Amir!" she called, her voice weak but full of relief. Tears filled Amir's eyes as he knelt beside her. "Amina, you're okay, you're okay," he repeated, his voice shaking. He hugged her tightly, unable to hold back the tears that streamed down his face. I was so scared, Amina whispered, her voice breaking. But I'm here. I'm here now. For a moment, the chaos around them seemed to disappear. The helicopters, the trucks, the noise, all of it faded into the background as Amir held his sister, feeling the warmth of her body in his arms. They had survived. Against all odds, they had made it through the worst storm Mayat had ever seen. The people of Mayat were not just survivors. They were fighters. They had faced the worst nature could throw at them, and yet they were still standing, still hoping, still reaching for a better tomorrow. As Amir looked around at the faces of the people around him, he realized that the storm hadn't just destroyed their homes. It had brought them together in ways nothing else could. The strength of the community, the resilience of the people, was something the storm could never take away. Amir knew it would take time for Mayat to rebuild, to heal, but there was a glimmer of hope now, a belief that the island could rise from the ashes, just like its people. And as long as there was hope, there was always a chance to start over.